Welcome to Last Week on Earth. I'm your host, Louisa Magnussen. The French political system has become fractured in recent years with three key players fighting for power. The left-wing New Popular Front, the centrist Ensemble coalition led by President Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party, and the far-right National Rally. This is Last Week on Earth, and now I would like to welcome my guest, journalist Gavin O'Toole, to discuss France's political situation in more detail and give you insight into what is going on in this close neighbouring country. Welcome, Gavin. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you?
I'm fine, Wizzy. Good morning to you.
Can you please give us a brief background on the crisis that has been unfolding in French politics?
Yes, so France's President Macron is facing the worst domestic crisis since he won the presidency in 2017. There's a stalemate in French politics, and the political class finds itself unable to form a government that will last long enough, in particular, to pass a budget. France needs to pass a budget. The National Assembly, which is France's parliament, is divided, as you mentioned in your intro, between three blocks, left, centre and right, and there's no really clear majority there. So a lot of stalemate. Budget for next year must be agreed soon, but the parties are at complete loggerheads over what should be in it, and there's been no stable government for weeks. It's a saga that's been going on for some time now. Under the French political system, the president directly appoints a prime minister to run a government. Now, since Macron became president in 2017, there have actually been 7 individuals in the office. The first 5 of these have had their job since January 2024. So they're kind of falling like dominoes, really. The latest episode began at the start of last week when Sébastien Lecornu became the 3rd prime minister to quit in the past year. And he resigned just 14 hours after he'd appointed a new cabinet.
14 hours?
14 hours. It's quite crazy.
That seems amazing because how can you get your head around anything in 14 hours? Why did he go into it in the first place?
Well, he's a close ally of Macron. He was drafted in after his predecessor had to quit because of a lack of consensus over the budget. And the main issue, of course, is Parliament, divided Parliament. If each of those parties has a kind of, or those groups, those coalitions, has a what they regard as a mandate, they all feel they should be represented in government. And of course, that's not what's happened. And so whoever Macron appoints is having a really tough time getting his cabinet approved by Parliament and actually making progress thereafter on policy decisions. And as I said, Lecornu resigned after he'd appointed a new cabinet because he faced that fierce opposition in the National Assembly. He refused to broaden the government to include some of their members. And then last Friday, Macron simply reappointed him to try again. So he gave up the job and now he's prime minister again. And let's see what he can do now. And this is an unprecedented development in French politics. It kind of suggests that Macron is running out of options.
Today, it's Friday, the 17th of October, 2025. What happened this week?
Lecornu's been trying to form a cabinet as quickly as possible. He sort of wants to try and include some of these left and right views in, but it's very difficult. He needs to form a cabinet so they can get to work on the budget because time is running out. And this week was crucial. There was a showdown effectively in the National Assembly. There's been fresh calls among those opposition parties for a new election. And in a measure of the instability, yesterday, Lecornu survived 2 no confidence votes that threatened to topple that nascent minority government just days after it had been appointed. They were submitted by the left, particularly France Unbowed, La France Insoumise, which came just 18 votes short of what was needed to topple this new government. And of course, the other one was submitted by the far right, Marine Le Pen's far right National Rally Party. And although the government survived both those votes, the closeness of the vote highlights the real difficulties that Lecornu faces as he prepares to kind of try and get that debate going on the national budget. And he only survived because of the socialists. They hold the balance of power, and he only survived because he promised them a delay, a suspension of a policy that's been at the core of this issue, which we'll go into maybe a bit later.
Can I just pause you there? Why do the socialists hold the balance of power?
Okay, the governing coalition occupies 1/3 of the parliamentary vote. The socialists are an important bloc within that vote. And the Socialists were formerly, prior to Macron, the governing party under Francois Hollande. So the Socialists are equivalent to the Labour Party. They're a kind of more establishment, centre-left, loosely left of centre, major party. They're not an insurgent party in a way that Macron's own party is, for example. So they try to compromise. They want to form a government by themselves, ultimately. As a result, because they have the balance of votes within the coalition, they have a lot of sway over Macron.
Now, why have France's problems particularly come to a head in recent months, do you think?
The antecedents can be found in Macron's own decision-making. He took a very reckless gamble after elections in 2024 for the European Parliament. He basically lost. Because he lost his mandate in that he dissolved Parliament, he called snap legislative elections, and that was a high-risk decision because the far right has been on the rise in France. They were riding high, and so he risked, on the one hand, handing power to the far right. That didn't happen, largely because this Popular Front coalition of the left was created. But as a result, we ended up with a hung parliament, and this was unexpected in a sense, and it was a reckless gamble. It didn't work. Macron thought he could get a new governing majority. That's not what happened. We were just talking earlier about the socialists. He got quite a weak governing majority, kind of minority government, effectively.
You think that this is one of the big reasons behind the reported dislike of President Macron across France?
Well, Macron typically blames everyone but himself for the crisis. And that does say a lot about him as a president. What it means in many ways is that his authority is collapsing. And a good example of that was his decision last year to call a snap election. He's growing kind of politically isolated, even within his own centrist coalition. His closest allies have publicly urged him to resign. Opposition leaders have called him the source of all the national paralysis. He's unpopular, Macron. He came into power in 2017 on the wave of enthusiasm, in a sense. But it was very similar in many ways to the election of Keir Starmer in the UK. It was a loveless landslide. Basically, people had a choice between the far left and the far right, and they didn't want either. And so he came along, this insurgent newcomer, fresh-faced, quite young, with a promise to kind of revive liberalism, and got a thumping, unexpected victory. And the liberal media praised him at the time for reaffirming the kind of democratic, liberal, centrist consensus that had always prevailed in France. But the trouble is, trust has collapsed, and that's one of the reasons for the political crisis. His economic policies have benefited the rich through basically unfunded tax cuts, and his domestic agenda is kind of generally hated by everyone, left and right, and that's reflected in this stiff opposition in Parliament.
It's noticeable how many countries appear to be facing political problems at the moment. It's not just France, is it? It's not just the UK. There's many countries facing political problems. Do you think there's something deeper going on with the very nature of democracy?
Yes, definitely. We're seeing this, aren't we, across Europe and in the UK as well. What we're witnessing really in a way is a crisis of political legitimacy, a broad erosion of trust in democratic institutions. Many citizens in these advanced democracies no longer believe their governments represent them. They see their leading elite as kind of viewing politics as very self-serving, elite-driven, detached from everyday struggles. And you're seeing similar patterns in Germany, where coalition instability weakens governance, and even in the United States, where polarization and populism are obviously challenging the whole democratic consensus. Allied to that is economic inequality, and that's probably in the long term, not just as a result of the financial crisis in 2008, but the broader switch in the 1990s to neoliberal reforms, which basically put cutting the state and cutting welfare at the heart of governments. The collapse of the political centre is one product of this. Weakening of traditional parties has opened spaces for people like Marine Le Pen and in Britain, Nigel Farage. They're promising very simple answers to complex problems. And you see...
go into more detail on the subject of economics. What are the exact problems that France particularly is currently facing?
Well, obviously, France is a classic example of this link between political and economic turmoil. Political crises rarely exist in isolation. They're almost always tied to deeper economic problems. And in France, the economic situation is pretty dire. It's becoming urgent. This is why the budget is so important. And the crux of the issue, very similar to Britain, lies in the state of the public finances. France currently has one of the highest budget deficits in the developed world. It's spending more than it's producing. It's kind of living beyond its means.
Billions in debt, isn't it?
It's also billions in debt. French gross national debt stands at a record high of 3.3 trillion euros. That's about 2.9 trillion pounds. And that represents 114% of GDP. Now, to compare that with Britain, which is also in trouble, the UK's gross national debt, was at 2.9 trillion, which is slightly lower than France's, and that's only 96.3% of GDP. So France is beginning in debt terms, is beginning to be regarded as the kind of basket case of Europe. And there have been consistently failed attempts at fiscal discipline. But there are deeper structural problems, and one of them is productivity. France's productivity has declined very rapidly in recent years. And as productivity declines, obviously eventually your tax take will decline. So that has a bearing on what, as a state, you can spend your fiscal sort of settlement.
What does this crisis mean for President Macron himself?
So he blames everyone except himself, and this reflects this kind of loss of trust between Parliament and the presidency. And if you regard Parliament as a kind of voice of the people, between the people and the presidency, his inability to secure a parliamentary majority has left him powerless, effectively. So there's been repeated votes of no confidence, and he, as I said, is quite isolated. That means he's sort of a lame duck president. He's finding it very difficult to push through any political change. There have been lots of reports recently about him walking alone, a bit like this kind of an isolated dictator in his presidential palace that everyone hates. And there's a long history.
Feel sorry for him, really, as a human.
Yeah, to the extent that you can feel sorry for politicians. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But the trouble is, for him, even with his own governing coalition and his centre-right Renaissance Party, there are signs of real disillusionment and fatigue. Basically, it's almost game over for Macron, and sooner or later he's going to have to see the light, and that will put his legacy at risk. And he, like a lot of people in this situation, has tried to build a nice foreign policy portfolio, a kind of record of achievement in the world as a statesman, as a kind of cushion to save his legacy. But I doubt whether that will save him.
Do France's current problems, all that we've discussed so far, have any implications outside the country? Could the issues pose further difficulties across Europe or here in the UK?
Yeah, France's problems have continental consequences for Europe and also for the UK. It risks European political stability. I mean, bear in mind, France is the EU's second largest economy, a core pillar of the European Union. So instability weakens that. It weakens its partnership, the Franco-German partnership, which the EU is built on. And a distracted or divided France makes it much harder for the EU to coordinate on issues like migration, defense, in particular Ukraine, and eventually enlargement. But also the crisis emboldens these populist far-right movements across Europe by showing that liberal centralism can collapse from within. And it has economic and financial impacts. Obviously, investor anxiety over France's rising deficit and debt raises borrowing costs not just for France, for Paris, but potentially for other Eurozone countries like Britain. People will look at France, investors will look at France, and they'll have Britain at the back of their mind. Have I got money in Britain? What do I have to do?
I would imagine this is also going to implicate people's feeling, the general public's feeling towards democracy itself, towards the political structure of European countries.
Listen, we're witnessing, aren't we, everywhere, and in particular France, the rise of the far right. In France, it's a serious issue because Marine Le Pen, the head of the National Rally, is a very clever political maneuverer. And she is engineering and has engineered a consistent rise in the support for the far right. Italy, the far right's in government. Across Eastern Europe, there are already far right governments, Hungary in particular. We're seeing reform in the UK well ahead in the polls. And I think the implications are very serious because if Macron decides to leave, and he'll eventually be forced out. I don't think he can survive till 2027. What prospect do we face? We face a very divided France with a insurgent far right that is gaining in the polls. Do we face the prospect of France turning far right, and we have to face that possibility because that would have major implications for Britain. Farage, who hates Europe and has made it no secret that he's make Britain great again, sort of isolationist, would simply point to what's happening in France, using migration as his kind of clarion
Vehicle.
call. Yeah, and say, look, they've done it, and they're our neighbour. Our channel borders are with France, so it's time for us to do it. I think it would have a major impact on British politics and on other European countries.
So there's huge implications, clearly. What are the likely and what are the possible outcomes of France's crisis, and how will it affect the people of France?
Well, the first and foremost, we're probably going to have at some stage, not in the too distant future, new elections, new legislative elections. It does appear unlikely that Lecornu will succeed where his predecessors have failed. Okay, he held it together yesterday, but he's got to pass a budget, and they disagree ferociously on most of the issues. That means if Macron dissolves Parliament, what happens next? Could it be another hung Parliament? Will we back to square one? Or will the National Rally, the far right, strengthen its position? Will they finally win a majority in Parliament? This is a prospect. Calls for Macron's resignation and possible presidential elections. Obviously, Macron, the clock is ticking. It's clear that his demands for his resignation have grown louder. They're no longer limited to the radical fringe. Even two of his former prime ministers have said you should step down. But he's under no legal obligation to step down before his term ends in 2027.
Do you think he will?
I think he'll have to. Although he's defiant. He's vowed to complete his mandate. There does come a point with any politician, no matter how sort of monarchic, which the French presidency has become, that they have to step down. And France has a long history of this, doesn't it? Where there's this kind of very powerful central figure in politics who shuts out the reality of a very volatile and unhappy country. And look what happens next.
Would you say that since the dissolution of the monarchy in France?
Yeah, so there are lots of countries where a monarchy has been displaced by a republican system, where they retain the trappings and the kind of political culture of monarchy. And France is one of them, but there are lots all over the world. Another one, for example, which is of interest to me, is Mexico. So the Mexican president is an unassailable figure. It's very hard to criticize the president because it's got this monarchic. They don't call it a monarchy in Mexico. They actually have a word for it, for the Aztec ruler. But the point being is that you get this everywhere. Russia's the same. Putin, in many ways, builds on the strong kind of authoritarian inheritance of Tsarism, which makes it much more difficult for democracy to function. And there are signs in France under Macron of growing authoritarianism. He is beginning to use his executive powers that don't have to go through Parliament to stifle dissent, certainly protest on the street. And that's always a bad sign, isn't it?
There's been a lot of protests on the street, haven't there? It's all over the news. Talk us through the protests.
Well, the main protests, ultimately, let's talk about the signature issue that has sparked protests, which is what Lecornu yesterday said he offered to suspend until the next presidential election, and that's pension reform. Now, pension reform has been a key source of protest and Macron's unpopularity. What he proposed in 2023, because of France's fiscal problems, is to extend the retirement age, and that's been done in Britain. The trouble is, in France, they have one of the lowest retirement ages in the world, or certainly in Europe, among industrialized countries. And as a result, the country spends a lot more on pensions than anything else, and than its competitors. So it's very politically difficult to reform pensions, even though that it's a pressing need from a kind of financial point of view. And his reforms in 2023 raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, which is still lower than ours and seems quite modest. But this sparked an absolute outpouring of protest, nationwide controversy. And ultimately, because of the opposition, they had to force it through Parliament without a vote. Now that's quite serious, isn't it? That means it doesn't have a normal democratic mandate.
It's not democracy, is it?
Well, there are rules in the French constitution which allow this. This is what's called executive authority. So from a legal point of view, it is legal. But of course, when there's something so controversial, if you don't have an obvious democratic mandate, that's going to leave a legacy of bitterness, which is precisely what's happening. So the main source of opposition right now, certainly political opposition, there aren't that many people on the streets right now in France, although in the summer there were very serious protests. They had what's called a total blockade, a day of, I forget the name of it, but basically people were on the streets yet again stopping the traffic because of the kind of budgetary situation. And of course, there's no leader in the world that will ultimately survive this forever. They will either have to make compromises, which Macron is kind of clearly signaling he's willing to do through Les Cornus, or they'll leave, they'll walk, which he said he won't do. Either way, they'll have to act. And either way, ultimately, France will have to do something because of its fiscal situation. So the pension reforms here to stay, if not now, if not 2027, sooner or later, I think that's an inevitability, and they won't like it.
Gavin O'Toole, that's all we've got time for today on Last Week on Earth. Thank you for your time today. We'll be back with episode 5 next Friday on your favourite podcast platform. Search Last Week on Earth, like, subscribe and download to keep up to date with our weekly discussion detailing the nitty-gritty of the world's news agenda. For now, I'm Louisa Magnussen. Thank you for listening. Thank you again, Gavin. I wish you all a good week ahead.